Welcome back to the Sim Geeks podcast. We are your hosts, William Belk and David Shablock, and we are going to do a little bit of talking today about low-budget tabletop simulation and when that's an appropriate alternative to the full-on production high-fidelity stuff. But before we get into that, I guess we have one or two quick announcements. One of them is that IMSH is again coming up on us very quickly, January 10th through 14th in Orlando again this year. And we will once again be representing IMSH and SSH there in the press box alongside some of our fellow podcasting friends at Simulation Operative and the Sim Cafe. I believe at this point that's what we're looking at, just the three of us. There may be a couple more. David, do you know of anyone else that's coming?
Don't know of anybody, but I have not been in the loop on that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be working through a handful of SSH guests like we've done in the past, as well as a few of our own that we are able to rope into this. And there may even be some cross-coverage collaboration with a couple of those other podcasts with us as well, where we can either jointly release information or join each other like we've done in the past, where we've jumped over and had them on ours or us on theirs. But like we said, today we were looking for something that we needed to be discussing, or a conversation that comes up with us quite frequently. And the conversation turned to not every sim needs to be a full-on high-fidelity blowout where everything is electronic and working and we do all kinds of craziness and we have 15 people running it. And sometimes it's okay just to sit down and have a conversation or work through something over a tabletop or playing out some low-budget options as well.
And sometimes it's even more appropriate, depending on the level of facilitation. Talking Axle Healthcare stands best practice, of course, and depending on what your learners' needs are. Or I was at a mini conference for EMS educators, and they don't have the $1 billion sim centers and things, but you can do just as much or, equal to that in other ways. And that's kind of what we wanted to do, is we wanted to take some time and say, hey guys, it doesn't always have to be the big show.
Yeah, making sure that we're matching complexity to our learning objectives, or matching our complexity and our learning objectives to the level of our learner, right? Not everybody is at that high-end level. We don't need a full-on surgical simulator to sit down and talk about EKG rhythms. We can do that without the machine being right there in front of us. So, we wanted to kind of rehash some of these things and talk about some of the definitions and what to us, what we talk high fidelity versus low fidelity, what that means here, because we all know that means different things from one group of people to another.
God, some people hate that word, fidelity. People go to the mat, fight you for it, but we're going to talk about it in generalities, and it'll be okay.
To just lay it down, for me, high fidelity is a marketing term. I know we've argued this before. We've talked about it. If you've spoken to us, you've definitely heard this. It's meant to make you want to spend more money to buy big fancy machines that maybe they're computerized, maybe they talk. Nowadays, we're starting to see AI. All of those are wonderful things to have in simulators, but we don't necessarily need them all the time. And so low fidelity, again, in that marketing, has been more on the task trainer side, where maybe you have a body form or maybe you have a body part that serves a purpose. You're able to assess it. You're able to do things, but it doesn't necessarily have any electronic or computerized elements. And then mid-fidelity is somewhere in between. So maybe it's got some computerized stuff, but maybe it doesn't have, chest rise and fall when it's breathing. Or maybe you can talk through it, but it's really just you using a microphone rather than having a computer program that has a bunch of stuff preset in it. And so understanding that from one company to the next, those may drastically differ. What's considered their high fidelity model or their low fidelity model. Go ahead.
And the hill I will go to die on is fidelity doesn't necessarily mean an electronic feature.
Yes.
And the most important thing you can have a low-tech, high-fidelity scenario, but you have to, A, set the scene, and 2, you need to make sure you're orienting to not just the equipment you do have, the room you do have in the area, but the rules of engagement. If you do those things, your learners will be immersed just as well. And it doesn't necessarily mean you need every feature.
And both SSH and Anaxle have said as such. They both have published very similar statements saying that fidelity does not necessarily lie within the capabilities of the equipment, but the capabilities of your facilitators as well as the details put into the simulation that you're running.
And that's huge, because when we talk about rural education, our friend Phil Wortham, our friend Bruce Williams, they're running these very, very good equipment. And they're also doing a lot of the things we're talking about here, where if they go to some place that doesn't have the big show all the time. It's they're providing resources of how to make this work when their big show isn't in town, or even for doing it themselves. And that's the thing, is that EMS is a big story of usually they don't have the equipment, the time, the effort for the big show. What can I do in a day room with 4 people?
And the one mannequin, right? Like I remember that from my EMS days. We were
Or none.
lucky if we had a mannequin. Usually we had a couple airway heads. We may have one ACLS thing to be able to go through and understand that, yep, that is a average sized male mannequin, but today it is a 28-year-old pregnant female. And then not be held back by, oh man, I can't do this because I don't have a pregnancy simulator. I don't have a birthing simulator or a maternal fetal. You don't need those things to get through the purpose of we're going to do an assessment, we're going to take a history, and we're going to make decisions about this patient's care. We don't necessarily need her to go through all of that other stuff. We don't need to see a baby delivered if the learning objective has nothing to do with the actual delivery of the child.
And that's huge. So I went to a nursing school back when I did nursing sims, and the only high feature set mannequin they had was Sim Junior. The adults they had was Nursing Ann, and it was a low fed or mid fed mannequin, but they wanted to have pulse points that generate better in more places. They wanted all that stuff. So initially, when I heard we're running Code Sims, adult Code Sims on a Sim Junior, I'm like, ah. But then I got over myself, and we set the scenario, we set the scene, we set the rules of engagement, and it just worked, and it worked fine. So what we want to do is show that don't let all of these things, even your preconceived notions, like my, getting over myself, don't let that limit you on giving your learners a good experience. Just use your mind, think outside the box, and get the job done to meet the learning objectives.
So speaking on that segue, David, you're saying think outside the box. We've kind of used the reference of, hey, we've got one mannequin or we've got this thing or a task trainer, and we need to build a whole scenario around it and do our best to deliver those learning objectives, but also create a good learning experience for our learners. What are some good examples, are probably the best term for it, but where are some ways that either you've seen it or that, we have seen the benefit of low fidelity or tabletop simulations taking a better place or taking the place of a high fidelity simulation?
The one that jumps out to me right to the top of the charts is I love mass casualties. I love a big field with a whole bunch of moulage people up and all around the field and moaning and groaning and all that. But if we really, really think about it, it is basically a game of logistics. And that can be a card game on a table of you have this, you have this, you have this. And it just depends on the learning objectives. But you talk about, you can run a resource management game on a tabletop very effectively and meet those learning objectives. And that's the one I want to build one of these. So if anybody else wants to build one of these, let's go.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. Having the ability to lay out your patients in front of you on a table and then go through and assign the appropriate resources to each patient or to each section of patients does not require a team of 30-something people and moulage and flipped over vehicles in a big open field or a parking lot. You can absolutely do that sitting at a table. The other good example, I think I already brought this up, but I'll bring it up again. You're a paramedic. I'm a paramedic, at least in a past life. I still carry a license, although I don't touch patients anymore. And so
for me,
when I went through paramedic school, which is getting a lot closer to 20 years than 10 now, so we didn't necessarily have a lot of resources. In fact, my paramedic school is still in existence, and they still don't have high-fidelity mannequins, right? They've got a handful that were hand-me-downs from the nursing department that were lacking laptops and other parts, and so they're just static mannequins. But when I went through school, that's all that we had. More importantly, the actual exam that stood between us and licensure at the end required no high-fidelity simulation whatsoever, even though it was a full day of hands-on practical skills. And probably the lowest or the best example of a low fidelity simulation was what they called our static cardiology exam. So they basically handed us flashcards that had an EKG rhythm of 6 seconds. And my job was to identify the rhythm and be able to list off the appropriate treatment for somebody who had that cardiac rhythm. And as soon as I did that, they would hand me another one. There was no patient in the room. There was no CPR to be delivered. There was no drugs to draw up. It was just one after the next, giving me a rhythm and making me verbally go through this board or oral exam and explain to them what I was going to do for that patient.
And it wasn't as many details, so it was actually easier is not the right word, but it's the first word that comes to mind. So it was, you're focusing on that portion of it, which at the learner level you were at was perfect. Because I thought you were going to talk about the oral station, but we'll talk about that later.
Well, we will. That's another thing we'll talk about. When we say tabletoping simulations, and that term gets thrown around a lot at my facilities, and they basically mean anything that's not. That's it. Yeah. There's no actual definition. I think that all of us are using the same, just like with the Fidelity. At my shop, what is normally meant is, hey, people were just standing around the mannequin and no one was actually doing it. They were just having a conversation about what the patient needed, but no one was hands-on with the mannequin, and they call that tabletop. To me, tabletop could be as simple as literally sitting at a table, discussing a scenario, and you across the table from me telling me what you would do as I bring up different things and move through it. All of those are appropriate ways to deliver education, right? We don't necessarily have to have a table. We don't need the high-fidelity mannequin. But if we're running a high-fidelity sim, then you need to be all in, hands-on, doing the things you're supposed to do.
But I will say, I was listening to what you were saying and thinking that all of those best practices still apply. Because how many of us have been through an ACLS station where they don't even let you have a chance to think? You have to do it the right way and give that person the amount of time to let that soak in and appropriately give you a response, and all the other best practices that go along with that. There's a right way and a wrong way of doing even tabletop gaming, which people look at as so easy. It's not if done right.
No, absolutely. And that's definitely a point that is here on our list of things to bring up, is just because we're talking about a low cost, low budget, low fidelity approach does not mean that we're taking shortcuts or that we're going to take the easy way out in doing this. So when we are developing a tabletop scenario, if we're developing a card game, which game development is a whole nother thing that we have an episode coming up on that we're going to work through.
Yes, we do.
But when we're talking about developing things that approach that, we still have to be very learner-centered. We need to look at our learning objectives. And then on top of everything else, just like if I'm running a full-on competition scenario or I'm running scenarios for experienced learners, it needs to be trialed. It needs to be tested. I need to know that it works, right? And if people are going to take a left turn and end up in a field somewhere, the game needs to be able to account for that or to drag them back to where they need to be. And I use game generically there. It could be a tabletop scenario where we're just sitting around having a conversation around a patient, but I need to be well-versed in what that patient needs. I need to understand that scenario before I go out there and try to facilitate it. Otherwise, it's just going to completely fall apart and we're going to lose our learning objectives.
And I'm glad you touched on that thing, the whole game thing, because I will say, I know that if you mention serious games or tabletop gaming of any kind, sometimes you'll get the eye roll or the deep inhalation. And it's really as powerful and impactful as high fidelity sim, depending on how you set it up and how you do it.
Again, so it comes back to appropriate use, right? And when it's something you can do. Now, if I need to teach a physical skill to a bunch of flight nurses or flight paramedics, and I need them to be able to do something invasive like a chest tube or a surgical airway, obviously sitting across the table from them talking about it and handing them cards of different patients is not the way to approach that skill set. But if I want to evaluate their ability to make the decision of when those procedures are appropriate and to know that they understand the guidelines surrounding the procedure up to the point of actually performing it or following it, making sure they're doing follow-up care appropriately, that is perfectly appropriate to be done in either a serious game or in a verbal sitting across the table having a conversation type situation. It's the actual physical skill. This is the same thing I've said about virtual reality on 1,000 different scenarios.
Totally just thinking the same thing. I mean, you're saying this, and I'm like, this is the same thing I think about for virtual reality. Yep. Stop doing tactile crap in VR.
Exactly. So what we are looking at here is knowledge assessment or being able to go through, not necessarily physical ability, physical skills, or anything that requires some kind of tactile assessment. If I need to feel something to understand what it is, then sitting across the table and describing the wound is not doing a whole lot of good, right? But if I can go through the whole head to toe assessment of this is what I'm going to be looking for, this is the treatment I'm going to apply if and when I find it, those things have a lot of value because you're having to think through that entire process. And then we as facilitators are watching you work through that process and making sure that you understand that approach to patient care.
It's exercising the thought of doing it before you're sitting in front of a patient and 1,000 other things are going wrong as well. So it allows you that quiet time to plan out your thought process or your approach to that event, that patient, or what have you, which we don't do enough of.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, thinking around the development of this, and we've hinted this already, the elements that we put into our serious game development, keeping in mind that serious games are any type of game that we've created for some purpose other than entertainment, right? So that we're trying to teach something, we're trying to learn something. When we look at that, those same types of learning objectives and those same approaches are what apply here to us doing it. So even if you're not putting a gaming element into your MASH casualty triage cards, but you are going to lay those cards out, we're looking at it in the same way. Your cards have to have the information. There needs to be established rule sets around what happens when these things come up. If this decision is made, then it triggers this event. You can't just throw a bunch of stuff on a table and say, hey, you have 37 patients, go take care of them. There needs to be established guidelines for this patient presents with these things. And the facilitator needs to know, either because it's on the back of the card or it's in a notebook that they're holding, what is the appropriate answer for that patient? What is that we're looking for and why, right? So that when that comes up, hey, David, why did you want me to do that? Because I was thinking I should do this other thing. You as a facilitator can come back to me and say, you know what, Will? This is why this was appropriate for this patient is because of insert whatever reason here. This injury automatically moves this person into this category. The fact that this person is upright, walking, and talking says that they can wait while you take care of someone else. But there should be a justification in that system and an established rule set that explains how that scenario plays out.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. It's, yeah, rules of engagement.
We talked about this, and we do that thing where after about 20 minutes, we start to slow down a little bit. I think there's a couple other things I do want to touch on real quick, too. We've talked a lot about cards. We've talked a lot about low fidelity mannequins, task trainers, etc. But we're also missing some other categories here where we talked about the static cardiology. One of the biggest things or one of the biggest areas that I see for a low fidelity approach to patient care is when we're talking about the limitations of our existing mannequins. And so going back and building on our conversation from earlier, if I go out and spend $113,000 on a brand new high fidelity mannequin that's designed to do everything from childbirth to swap the abdomen out, now I have an adult, ungravid female, that's great, except for if I need an obese female patient, right? That mannequin doesn't necessarily work without having to do add-ons and do other things. Or if I buy a standard pediatric mannequin, it tends to be a 5 or 6 year old boy. If I need something that is female, yeah, I can throw a wig on it, but physiologically and anatomically, it's still a boy, right? And so making sure that as we're going through this, areas that we can use other low fidelity tools may be something as simple as, look, I don't have a 3-year-old mannequin, so I'm going to use a printout of a 3-year-old with an appropriate Broslow, saying, hey, this is what the measurements are, or hell, print it life size if you really want to, laminate it. But making sure that we have that approach of, I didn't just say, hey, David, welcome into the room. Ignore the fact that Timmy over there is 4.5 feet tall and apparently 8 years old. Now that is Christina and she's 2.5. It just doesn't add up, right? And so we're breaking that fiction contract already. So maybe it's more appropriate to print off that 2.5-year-old, or even dolls. If you can't afford 14 different mannequins of different sizes, there's nothing wrong with going out and picking up a Cabbage Patch and saying, this is our term newborn compared to our toddler child that we have, or this is our preemie that we picked up.
Or I've seen people take, generic image of Timmy, Johnny, whatever, Janie, and put it on the towel patient. And we can't underestimate the use of a towel patient, because you know what? It would be wildly easy to make a different size in the Broslow tape. A towel patient. because all I have to do
Absolutely.
is fold the towels a different way, so it's a little longer.
With almost zero outlay for cost, right? Couple pennies and ink and paper, and that's it.
And
Uh,
that's the thing, is that you can do this low resource, low equipment, but you do have to put in the work to make it an enriching experience. You have to plan it well. You can't just Wild West wing it. It's got to be done right.
That's the answer, right? It doesn't matter if it is something you've printed out and thrown on the floor, if it's something you've made out of towels, if you drew it by hand. None of those things really matter if at the end of the day you've dialed in your learning objectives, you've gone through the process of trialing it and making sure that it works, and it meets the needs of your program or your learners at whatever level they're at. That's what matters. Sure, it may not be $150,000 and shiny and exciting. It may not be a brand new VR headset. But if I can sit down and I can get through to a student by using something that I completely made out of clay, then so be it. That's perfectly fine as well.
I see it in Moulage all the time. People get so wrapped around the axle of I have nothing, I can't do anything. And yet I've seen people literally take a piece of white paper, put a red marker on it, and tape it to the mannequin. And they're like, oh, this is so bad. I said, does it meet the learning objective? Yeah. Did your learners get it because you set the scenario and the scene right? Well, yeah. Then it's beautiful.
Damn it, David. We almost made it through an episode without having to talk about Moulage, but here we are again.
It fit. You know me.
So,
I'm gonna talk about it.
awesome.
I mean,
Well,
also, Monday I've got my Moulage meeting coming up. So for those of you who don't know, not that I'm advertising this, but the fourth Monday of every month, I'm trying to have a meetup. I post it out absolutely everywhere. So if you don't have a link, contact us and I can get you on it. But it's 7 p.m. Eastern every fourth Monday, hence the long name with the four M's in it. Let's talk about one thing we talked about before the show was you had an experience. We're not going to name the company because not sponsored and all that, but you had an experience. So there are some pre-built equipment training out there. So maybe you can't afford a whole mannequin necessarily, but you had a pretty good experience with a boxed gaming system.
yeah, I mean, there's a few of them out there. I know that, and I don't know the exact name of it off the top of my head right now, but for a while, my program was using these foam board patients basically where they folded up and they went into a nice little carry case and we moved them around. It had the ability to unfold a toddler or unfold a 13-year-old kid or unfold a 9-year-old, and at the end of the day it all just collapsed back down into a briefcase ish. It was a little bigger than a briefcase, and with it was a binder full of scenarios and a few other things. And I mean, it wasn't inexpensive, it wasn't cheap, it was in the several $1,000s range, but several $1,000s for 13 patients in a box is a hell of a lot cheaper than even a single task trainer nowadays.
And all the hard work was done for you. It was
Bingo.
vetted. It was done cases. You didn't have to think about it. And the other thing is, it would give you ideas on how you'd build a different sort of system that you could utilize. And it would give you some good experience on, this is how they set it up. Oh, you know what? We could do this for that. So whereas, it might not fully meet your needs, or it meets it here, but you have other ones, it would be a great thing to get the experience of how to build your own. Because a lot of people get vapor locked on, it's just so much, I can't do it. You can. There's resources out there. And I mean, the name that we've been avoiding most of this whole episode, and let's just say it is, when you did your oral station for NREMT, what did you feel like you were playing?
Oh, so dude, you're going to get me on a whole nother thing here.
Oh,
So,
I totally am, but I'll limit you.
what David's getting at here is the whole idea that an oral station plays out a lot like a role playing game. So it's that Dungeons and Dragons Pathfinder type feel thing, right? And the reason he's hinting at this is that for the last several years, I have been doing an absolute shitload of work for professional development of simulation educators using role playing games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons. So
Have you?
weird, right? Yeah. So I'm sure most of our listeners, or quite a few of them, have heard me speak on this in public. I've done it at several conferences around the United States, but also have a few things on the horizon. We have a paper coming up that'll hopefully be published on the subject that has been in the works for way too long. That'll happen. And then also starting a large multi-agency research project that'll go in front of an IRB here in the next couple of weeks, hopefully, where we're researching, does this actually improve teamwork, communication, empathy, etc. So at the end of the day, what he's getting at is in the very near future, you're going to hear way more than you ever wanted to know about Dungeons and Dragons from us here at the Sim Geeks podcast, as well as the science, the information, and the research to back it up.
And you're legitimizing the reason why we like to play Dungeons and Dragons, because that oral station was D&D. It was, if you didn't ask for it, you didn't have it, and they had to lay it out. And, there was actually good things and bad things about that. And we can, in the next episode, we can go through all of that stuff. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say, is that you're doing a lot of serious big boy work on this to show that it is really a thing. And I remember being at the Sun. Laerdal had the Sun a couple years ago, and Dr. Dreyfus was on the stage, and she was like, whatever simulations you're doing right now, figure out how to double it this year, and next year triple it. But that was all good, but the real important thing she said, and simulation might not look like what you see it look like today. So you need to open your minds and look at how other simulation exists in the world. And this is a big opportunity of how to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the vast availability of role-playing games. Like, there's thousands of different games. If you're not into fantasy, you could be into pirates, or you can be into the Old West, or whatever else. Hell, you can raise kittens in one of those adoption facilities. There's all kinds of weird games out there. But underlying theme in all of them is collaboration, right? So you have an element of chance, which is your dice rolling, and then you have the collaboration and teamwork and everything else. And so, yes,
and
we're going to spend way too much, and communication, all of it. So we're going to spend way too much time talking about that. So I don't want to get into it right now.
No. We're going to pull it back. We're going to pull you back.
We are, and we're going to, we're hopefully going to rope in a couple of friends that have been part of that research from the beginning, and we will come back at you guys with that. But at the end of the day, you're not wrong. The idea that tabletoping scenarios plays out a lot like a role-playing game. The only difference is the chance element. So you remove the dice element from there, and hopefully the educator on the other side of my oral exam was not just trying to trip me up and screw me over. They were actually trying to work me through a scenario, right? It's not meant to be a trap.
With best practices.
Exactly.
That's what I mean. Hopefully they were using best practices of, it's not a torture box, just like the big high-fidelity sim. You still have to have the same best practices and work it in the same mindsets you would with sim.
Which is a whole other thing we should talk about, is EMS simulation and where it's come from and where it's headed, because I have a lot to say on that subject as well. But all right.
and now we can even do military sim, and that would be how we would rope Max Dodgen back into this too, because we need to get him into an episode. But that's absolutely for another time.
Awesome. Well, we're sitting right at a half an hour, just below a half an hour. So thanks again for your time. Thanks for listening to these episodes. If there's anything that you guys want to see from us, or anything that you're hoping to, kind of see us cover in the future, feel free to look us up when we're sitting at IMSA, or send us a quick email, simgeekspodcast@gmail.com. David, any closing thoughts?
I just appreciate you all for listening, and hope we hear from you in the coming year.